when last we left this story, the 151st Pennsylvania was heading out to McPherson Ridge, and the 1st Corps line was beginning their retreat across this open field that you see to our west. Now, it was not a pell-mell run back to Seminary Ridge. It was very orderly. Henry Morrow, the 24th Michigan, said we were...
I just said yep.
Forced back.
That's a good one. That's a good quote.
Forced back, step by step, contesting every foot of ground.
Remember, the 24th Michigan is the same guys that fought the 26th North Carolina in the bloodiest, literally the bloodiest combat of the entire battle.
Yeah.
And
they're orderly coming
Michigan,
back.
26th North Carolina. And this is how they leave that combat.
John Kalis, 2nd Wisconsin, says he turns around and looks at the seminary, makes that his objective point, and begins to pull back. And they're going to end up not far from where we're standing today. This is all due to the linear tactics that these men had been trained on. They are trained to do this over and over.
The 7th Wisconsin does the retreats by the flank, correct?
Retreats by the flank, yes.
Hey, there are regiments that are using an absolute textbook move. They start in their line of battle. They then break to the rear into their marching columns, and all 10 companies march parallel. They stop. They go back into line of battle. They wheel into the long line of battle for the regimental front. They fire a volley. They begin to load. They march by the flank again. They can march very fast that way, much faster than in line of battle. So they're using Hardee's tactics to the T to execute this retreat.
And it's keeping it's keeping Pettigrew's men at bay. Pettigrew's men get to the top of the ridge, and they stop. And they don't advance down through the open field down here to the barricade of rails.
According to Abner Perrin, the reason that they do this is because they're new troops who want to stand off at a distance and fire rather than charge. Pettigrew's troops had been down on the North Carolina coast. They're just now back with the Army of Northern Virginia for the first time, and this is their first big battle. Robert E. Lee's army was not about standing back and shooting at the enemy. Robert E. Lee's army was about what Abner Perrin does about 45 minutes later.
As we will see. Well, the 1st Corps line makes it back here to this barricade of rails. Behind them is going to be 21 cannon of the 1st Corps artillery under Charles Wainwright. At this point, Wainwright has commands to hold Seminary Ridge at all costs. Most of the artillery is going to be concentrated from the north end of the seminary building.
Right where we started.
Right, almost exactly where we started, in front of the present-day chapel, in front of the Krauth House, all the way up to what becomes Lee's headquarters. And there's even a battery of artillery on both sides of the railroad cut in the front yard of the Widow Thompson. So behind all of these tired 1st Corps men is artillery under one of the best artillery commanders in the Union Army.
Just to get a quick lay of the land, if you look over to your left, you can see the end of the barricade of rails that we've reconstructed, but that would have come out just in front of this slope behind the President's house and then out to the Krauth House. And this is where the infantry line goes. So we're right in the front of the rail barricade, and also right in front of Wainwright's artillery concentration. Can I say something about artillery tactics?
Sure.
Yes,
why not?
I love tactics. So it's important to understand tactics, because when you read these reports, you need to be able to see how cleverly they use the manuals. They use these manuals. Now, in this case, with Wainwright's artillery concentration, they're not using the manual. They're actually closing the distance between the cannons so they can jam as many guns as they can between the seminary and the railroad cut. And typically, artillery pieces were about 14 to 17 yards apart. That's the regulation distance between the hub of one gun and the right hub of one gun and the left hub of the next. Behind them, so we're going to get to this in a few minutes, but you need to think about it. If you turn around and look where Stevens' battery was, the gun is there, the marker's there right in front of the tour road. That gun sits in the front with a crew of 6, 5 yards behind. From the horse's nose at the lead of the limber team, from the horse's nose to the trail of the gun is 5 yards. Then you have 6 horses, 2-horse team. Then your limber chest. Then the man that's fixing the fuses for the ammunition. 10 yards behind that are the caissons for each gun. Every gun, all of these 21 guns that Pete's talked about, has a limber with 6 horses and has a caisson with 6 horses. So not only is this a very wide formation, but it's a very deep formation. It's about 45 yards from the front of the gun to the back of a battery position. It is a huge chunk of ground. Let's remember that when we start thinking about how those guys get back over there.
We'll talk about that later on. So,
Yes.
This is the setup. About 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 1st Corps infantry behind the barricade, artillery up on the ridge, waiting for what's going to come next.
And what comes next is a classic Robert E. Lee move. We know this starting in the Peninsula Campaign, all the way through the 2nd Manassas Campaign, through Sharpsburg. Well, they don't attack at Sharpsburg. Well, some of these guys end up attacking.
Let's talk about it today.
It's a very aggressive series of campaigns that Robert E. Lee undertakes between the time he takes over command of the Army of Northern Virginia at the end of June 1862.
Which is about almost exactly a year.
Almost exactly a year. And they're on a winning streak. And they're on a winning streak because Lee was audacious. Lee was willing to attack. His officers were willing to lead. And his men were willing to follow. Most of these men really had skin in the game. And no more so than Perrin's South Carolina Brigade. This is Maxie Gregg's old brigade. If you remember him from Fredericksburg where he's killed, it's Sam McCowan's brigade for the rest of the war. McCowan had been wounded. This is a theme in Lee's army. Brigadier generals, colonels, lieutenant colonels, being wounded, being disabled, being killed in combat because they lead from the front. And this is a problem for Lee's army. He's bleeding his officer corps white. And by the time he gets to Gettysburg, he's just about done them in, these first round guys. The men that Abner Perrin, the colonel of the 14th South Carolina, leads are some of the, if not the most advanced secessionist, pro-South, pro-Confederates you could find on the planet. Remember, the numbers mean something. That's kind of sound like a broken record, but it's important. The lower the number, the earlier the volunteer time starts. That was an awkward way of saying it. These are early guys. 1st South Carolina, PACS, Provisional Army of the Confederate States, fights right here. The 14th South Carolina, they are part of the first call from the state of South Carolina, which is the first state to secede. Some of the men from the 1st South Carolina had actually been in military organizations as early as the fall of 1859. They were in Minutemen companies. These Minutemen companies, remember what I said about Fairfield District? All of South Carolina is the same except Horry County up in the northwest or northeast corner of the state. Every county is majority black, majority enslaved people. And after John Brown's raid, the planters are very concerned about a slave rebellion. And they organize what they call Minutemen companies. And 2 of the companies that make up the 1st South Carolina are Minutemen companies. 2 of the companies of the 1st South Carolina are old militia companies from Charleston. So these guys had been organized early and then organized right at the real crisis point when things really started to heat up in 1859 and 1860 as a local defense force. 14th South Carolina had, I think, 1 Minutemen company in it, but these are all regiments. The 13th South Carolina is to their farther down. The 12th South Carolina is a little bit farther down, and the 1st South Carolina Rifles, led by the former governor of South Carolina, is back guarding the wagons in Cashtown. So these guys are the elite of the elite. They are from the richest plantation districts in South Carolina. They're led by men like Maxie Gregg, who had been a signatory on the Ordinance of Secession. They had the first quartermaster of the 1st South Carolina, Leonidas Sprott, had been the editor of the Charleston Mercury, the hottest secessionist newspaper in South Carolina. And I can say bad things about South Carolina because my family's from there. They are very hot people, and they're very strong-willed.
Can I speak about the 14th for a moment?
Can I finish with Sprott, and then you can? Leonidas Sprott. Well, you're going in different directions here. Leonidas Sprott was the editor of the Charleston Mercury. Was the first commissary of the 1st South Carolina, had in 1859 and 1860 written a series of articles that advocated for the reopening of the African slave trade. These are the men who are leading, and their sons and their nephews and their neighbors are the men who are in the ranks of the 1st South Carolina, of the 14th South Carolina. Let's do it in order. The 14th South Carolina, the 1st South Carolina, the 13th South Carolina, the 12th, and then back over on the mountains, those guys from the upstate and the Orr's 1st South Carolina Rifle. These were the leading lights of secession, and they are embodied. They have gone from the debate halls to the field, and this is where they end up at Gettysburg. Pete.
So, one of the members of the 14th South Carolina, when it's formed in 1861, is Frank Muller, son of Washington Muller, who we started our story with, who was a student here in 1832. Frank Muller is not going to be here at Gettysburg because he is wounded at Chancellorsville in May of 1863. But his friends, his messmates, are all going to be here. They are probably, some of them, taught by Washington Muller. So it's coming full circle here that those debates that Washington Muller was probably involved with inside the seminary are now going to come outside to that very same ground.
To the left of these fellows were a bunch of mountaineers from North Carolina. The outliers of outliers in Robert E. Lee's army. This is Dorsey Pender's old brigade. It's commanded by Alfred Scales here at Gettysburg. The 16th North Carolina, the 22nd North Carolina, the 34th, 38th, and 13th South North Carolina. Only one of those regiments comes from a plantation district. You couldn't have found more different people in all of the South than the ones who are here from Charleston, from Fairfield, from Edgefield District, from Newbury, South Carolina, from Lexington, South Carolina. And these guys from Rutherfordton, from Morganton, from way up in the mountains of North Carolina. Gosh, 16th North Carolina fights right out here behind your right over your shoulder. They had an officer who, after the 7 Days campaign, deserted, went back to Ashe County, North Carolina, and organized a Unionist militia. They have a terrible desertion problem. Dorsey Pender, who is their brigade commander, has to use extraordinarily strict discipline to keep these men in line. These are men who don't own slaves. They don't come from the slave South. They come from the mountain South. And they have a very different attitude as to what ought to be happening now. Many of these men are part of William Holden's Peace Party in North Carolina. They supported the anti-war faction, not anti-slavery, but anti-war faction in North Carolina politics. In fact, in the ranks of the 34th North Carolina, just before the Battle of Chancellorsville, there were rumors that North Carolina had gone back into the Union. One of the lieutenants who ends up being mortally wounded out here, and I'm suddenly forgetting his name. Could you help me?
Tom Cotton or George Huntley.
George Huntley. George Huntley from Rutherfordton, North Carolina, is wounded, mortally wounded out here in the field, somewhere about the middle of that cornfield. He went into the Army from Rutherfordton up in the mountains, goes down to Raleigh, has a good time in camp. He's this local school teacher. His father's the local doctor. And he goes down to Raleigh and joins the Army, or he joins with his friends, and they go to Raleigh. And he's excited. He said, he wrote a letter back to his dad. He said, you'd see more in a day in Raleigh than you'd see in a whole lifetime in old Rutherford. He loved to go to the bookstore. And in fact, he re-enlisted for the duration of the war so he could get a bounty, so he could go book shopping in Raleigh, because he thought the war would be over before his term of service expired. Yeah. He starts writing letters back home. And after a few weeks in camp, soldiers start dying. And he says, if you have to come to the Army, because now we're in the draft period of the Confederate history. If you have to come to the Army, come on, but make sure you come with good officers. There's nothing worse than bad officers. We've got a lot of them down here. And then the war goes on. They get engaged for the first time on the peninsula. They see combat. They see hard combat. And he says, if you can avoid it, if you can get into some kind of profession that will keep you out of the draft, do it. And by the period between Chancellorsville and Gettysburg, both Huntley and Tom Cotton, who Pete mentioned just a minute ago, are writing letters back home saying, don't even think about coming to the Army. They're encouraging these people implicitly to go hide out in the mountains and resist Confederate conscription officers who are coming into the mountain regions of the South. Two different Souths right here in front of us. Two different sets of politics, different sets of social relations, different interests in being in the Army, and they are going to make the final attack, this final push on this critical position. So, we've got Pettigrew's guys who've been fought out. Herron makes the snarky comment, you know, like new troops, they would stand off at a distance and fire. And he says, when we marched across them, they were only able to give up a weak little cheer for old South Carolina. It almost sounds like a, I know. In any case, Herron had an idea about what was going to happen and how it was going to unfold. And remember that Perrin's Brigade, Pender's Brigade, these two organized bodies of men who were going to come across this field had been at some of the ugliest, hardest fighting of the Civil War. They'd been at the Stony Hill at 2nd Manassas and helped hold the railroad cut. They had been at the hardest part of the fighting at the Battle of Fredericksburg. They'd been right in the middle of Chancellorsville. They were the troops that marched from Harper's Ferry to Sharpsburg and saved Lee's army at the Battle of Antietam. These are the best of the best. This is A.P. Hill's old Light Division, and they don't mess around. Abner Perrin gets his officers together. Remember, he had been the colonel just a few weeks before, had been the colonel of the 14th South Carolina, so this is his first command gig. He goes to his officers, brings them together, have the men load, fix their bayonets, and don't let a man fire until I tell him to. He's not going to make the mistake that Johnston Pettigrew did in letting his men stand off at a distance and fire. He's going to close with the enemy. So they advance across the top of the ridge at the same time, and they're in the little swale back behind McPherson's ridge. They're down near the McPherson's barn, Scales' troops are, and then off to the left in the woods around Herbst Wood, and the Herbst Woods are Perrin South Carolinians. And they begin their advance, and they come across the top of the hill, and what do you think happens?
The artillery is going to open up. And I'm going to read my quote now.
Why don't you read your quote now, because they don't even get to the top of the ridge before things start to unravel.
So this is a quote from Greenleaf Stevens, who's commanding the battery that's right up here. The whole line of battle from right to left was then one continuous blaze of fire. The space between the two ridges was completely filled with the blue smoke of the infantry. Remember how I said when we were down there, think about the way that this is going to turn into a bowl or a saucer, making it difficult to distinguish friend from foe, while the artillery from their higher position belched forth a tremendous fire of shot and shell, throwing their deadly missiles in rapid succession into the ranks of the enemy, advancing on our direct front, covering themselves for the moment in dense clouds of white smoke. Our infantry, but the overwhelming numbers of the enemy 5-1, were forced back upon a line with the artillery, some of them crouching under the very muzzles of the guns of the 5th Battery to avoid fire. When our front was clear and within canister range, using double charges, the guns of the 5th Battery were turned to the right on the columns of the enemy, and when their first line was about 100 yards from the seminary, it was brought to a halt.
So that's what Scales men experience as they come across the top of the ridge here. The left wing of Perrin's brigade encounters the same fire. The 14th South Carolina, the 1st South Carolina, as they move across the field, are taking this same artillery fire. And let's very briefly do what happens to Scales. Scales men, depending on which account you choose to believe, got somewhere between that fence rail in the middle of this orchard. And that's as far as they got. The artillery fire had been wrecking the line as they came across the ridge and down the slope. The infantry fire picks up, as Pete quote shows so dramatically, and Scales' men could not make any further advance. And they go to ground. They keep up a fire. They're firing at a distance, right? They're not doing what veteran troops do. Perrin, meanwhile, over here, somewhere around the bench where we were just standing, encounters problems with his brigade. In his brigade, there's a fence that kind of runs out at an oblique angle, according to one South Carolinian, from the edge of the seminary. And as the 1st South Carolina crosses that, their line becomes disordered, and they're a solid mass. The next regiment, the 14th South Carolina, which is right on line with where we're standing, begins to falter. And they are following Scales' men, starting to lay down and starting to lose that forward momentum that Perrin was counting on to carry the charge and carry the attack. So what does Abner Perrin do? Well, he's a Mexican War veteran, a very ambitious man. He wants to be a division commander someday. He doesn't make it, but he makes it through this. He rides his horse out in front of the line. Right where we were standing, down at the bottom of the swell. He rides his horse out in front of the line. And he reorganizes the 14th South Carolina, gets them up and moving. He gets the 1st South Carolina reorganized and up and moving. Remember, there's the barricade of rail. There's Abner Perrin.
And the small arms fire has started at this point.
About 200 yards, the small arms fire starts from behind the barricade of rail. Perrin gets these guys moving. He sees farther to the south a gap at the end of the rail barricade between the cavalry force is holding the line south towards the Fairfield Road. He sees a gap down there, and he says, 12th and 13th South Carolina, y'all go that way. 1st South Carolina, kind of march sideways, obliquely, get around the edge of this barricade of rails and start shooting. And 14th South Carolina, get up and go and close with these men behind this barricade of rails. It had to have happened no quicker than what I just told. Perrin was a brilliant tactical leader.
He probably said y'all, too.
He certainly said y'all. Y'all get going. And probably an accent pretty close to that. Anyway, now he's from Charleston, so it was going to be a lot longer. It's going to take a lot. Maybe it took a little bit longer than it took me to tell. I got an upstate accent. So anyway, upstate coast don't get along. Anyway,
sorry, broke your train of thought.
Thank you. You broke my train of thought. I'm telling a really dramatic and important story about people being killed. This is kind of sometimes really jarring for me. Is this is weird sometimes. Anyway, he makes the decisions and he gets his men moving. The 12th and the 13th South Carolina go right through the Union line down here at the Samuel Simon Schmucker house. Remember, Schmucker had fled. After they capture the house, they go into the house. They tear up the painting of his father. They wreck the house. They take his books from his library, throw them out in the lane behind the building. In fact, in the museum right now, we have the very Bible that was taken out, Schmucker's personal Bible that was taken out and thrown out in the backyard and then replaced by a Confederate soldier the next day. It's on display right now. But these guys go through, smash the house up, 1st and 14th South Carolina. Because of what the 1st is doing, the Union line begins to unfold from south to north. 12th and 13th are making their way across the ridge and off towards the McClellan Farm area, or the what am I trying to say? The house behind my house.
Oh, the McMillan.
McMillan house. McMillan and wife. That's how you remember. When I first moved here, that's how I remembered it. In any case, they moved to the southwest or to the southeast. 1st and 14th go straight across the ridge. And these guys get up and they follow. These guys...
Well, we're going to talk about it up there, right? The retreat?
Yes.
Yeah.
These guys have a hard deal. So let's go take a look at that and talk about what the Union troops do as they retreat.